The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand. We gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise to get what we want. We got to organize.
Good day, good evening, good afternoon, good night, dear comrades, good people, wherever you are in the world. This is a podcast represented by the All African People's Revolutionary Party, Pantsula Podcast. I am Jamilah, here with my comrades Jeffrey and Salifu. And myself and Jeffrey, we are usually here in the Pantsula Podcast representing the Kaji Circle aspect of the whole party. So this is a program of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Of course, our objective as the All African People's Revolutionary Party is to have a unified socialist Africa through scientific socialism. If you have any questions around that, please let us know. But we're all over the internet, and there are various programs of the A-APRP where you can have those questions answered. AAPRP-intl.org. That's the first of all. So with that, we also want to give honor and thanks to our ancestors, because without the work that they have done, we wouldn't be here today. And I just want to say that with, if you've seen last week's episodes, a lot of the struggles I'm having, it's just really being grateful to the ancestors and grateful to the universe has really helped me quite a bit in just trying to be as mentally healthy as possible. So in this, we're going to pass it to Jeffrey to talk about our ancestors.
All right. Hey, everyone. Just like as Jamilah said, we dedicate each episode to two of our ancestors. The first one being Ben Bella. Ben Bella was an Algerian revolutionary. He was a member of the FLN. For those who are not familiar with FLN, an acronym is the National Liberation Front. They were engaged in the war for liberation against the French. Ben Bella was also the president. He was elected president of September of 1962. The socialists, and so that's the first one. The other ancestor we like to dedicate this episode to is Amy Ashwood Garvey, who is a Pan-Africanist, as many of you guys know, was also the first wife of Marcus Garvey. She was the founder of the Negro World Paper, also the director of the Black Star Line steamship. She also was a part of the Fifth Pan-African Congress, which is how we define Pan-Africanism in the A-APRP. She also set up the Afro People Center and co-founded the Association for the Advancement of Colored People in London. So with that being said, we like to once again thank and honor our ancestors for everything they've done. And we'd like to welcome our guest here, Salifu. This episode is that we're going to be talking about Cuba. I know recently he made a trip there. So let's actually probably start off with allowing you to introduce yourself, Salifu, and then we'll probably get into the questions after that.
Word. Thanks y'all for having me. I'm a fan of the show, so it's nice to be here. Also kick it with some people from the party. I'm Salifu, editor at Hood Communist, member of the Black Alliance for Peace, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, repping the Sabukwe Work Study Circle. You already know. And the Low Country Action Committee out of Charleston, South Carolina. And I recently had an opportunity to go and spend 10 days in Cuba with Pastors for IFCO and Pastors for Peace. And just for a little context, I guess, historical background on Pastors for Peace and why I dipped out with that delegation. So the Pastors for Peace was started in the 1980s by African pastor in the US named Lucius Walker. This is during the Reagan presidency. And if anybody listening knows anything about the war on drugs, which is really just the war on Black people in the States, the United States was getting drugs into Black communities through their support of a reactionary force in Nicaragua called the Contras. And as you already know, there's lots of propaganda in the US all the time about what's happening in foreign countries, as particularly more so now that we have all kinds of media and whatnot. But at that time, it was confusing for a lot of Black people, lots of Africans in the States to wrap their heads around. So Reverend Walker took the initiative to gather a group of people and went down to Nicaragua to understand what this better understand what this Sandinista revolution was all about, what these people called the Sandinistas, who were they, what did they want, what were they fighting for. And during their time in Nicaragua, the delegation was attacked by the Contras, who were the reactionary force that were being funded by the United States. And Reverend Walker was injured. So upon his return to the United States, after healing and everything, he started to speak out against Reagan. He started to speak out against the United States, and he started to speak out against this concept called imperialism, this term that people had never really heard or couldn't well understand. And he kind of made it his life's work to continue organizing solidarity delegations between folks in the US and folks in the global South. So that first delegation was in Nicaragua. That was in the 1980s. And in 92, they made their first trip to Cuba, where he was able to meet Fidel, better understand the Cuban Revolution. Yeah, so he passed away a few years ago, but the legacy of Pastors for Peace lives on through his daughter, Gail Walker. And that is who organized this latest delegation that I went on, Pastors for Peace.
There's definitely the conversation which Salifu Ture speaks about a lot, the merging of religion and revolution. And when we have organizations and groups like Pastors for Peace, understanding the connections that happen between Africans in the diaspora, the Africans back home, African Caribbean, so diaspora, but understanding the roots of imperialism hurt us all. And to take those spiritual elements, and if someone is going to say, for instance, I'm looking at the values of Christianity, I think to truly look at the values of Christianity, you have to understand the inhumanity of capitalism. You have to understand how imperialism is connected to that. So I think that Pastors for Peace is doing some great work in bringing attention to that. And I'm going to keep saying that the Sandinistas indirectly were the major inspiration for me to understand that capitalism was a bad thing at 10 years old. So I am forever grateful to the Sandinistas. And even, if we look at everything dialectically, I am grateful that my mother had the Iran-Contra hearings on, because I was like, there's something wrong with this picture. So even grateful to that, to even just have in my brain this understanding that there's something inherently wrong with the system in the US. So yeah, I just wanted to add to that. Thank you.
I wanted to kind of start off. I know you mentioned your trip and the 10 days you're out there. If you could just talk about the events leading up to you going, and like your understanding of Cuba, your analysis before you had went, and what may have changed after your trip. So I know this is probably a loaded question, so if you need to repeat anything, let me know. But yeah, just pretty much the events leading up to you going, your understanding of Cuba and your trip.
Yeah, so everybody I know that's been to Cuba before, or even people who I don't know, I noticed that the way people approach taking their first trip to Cuba, because this is also my first time ever leaving the States. People are always like, when you read like their journals and their diaries and stuff, they'd be like, I went to Cuba with an open mind to see I did not. Based on all the things that I had read and studied, all the people that I know who've been, I went to Cuba very much already in support of the Cuban Revolution, right? That was like, I was not there to like, I don't know, on some like objective mission to see if socialism really works. I already know that socialism works. I just wanted to see how it's working in Cuba, right? Like I wanted to be able to lay my eyes on it, breathe the air, feel it with my skin, so that it could make even more sense to me than it already did. So I prepared for this trip all year. Just on a personal tip, I knew that I was going to Cuba this year by hook or by crook. So I was looking for every delegation, any potential plane ticket, work opportunity, because when the pandemic came and the Trump administration was wilding, and then Biden came and then Biden kept wilding, I was like, the first opportunity that I get to go, I have to take it, because who knows when I'll ever be able to go again. So I started this year just doing like basic political education. Like I started here, Race to Revolution by Gerald Horne, because I feel like in order to talk about Cuba's contemporary situation, you need to understand historically where it's come from, like what it was like during its period of slavery, what it was like pre-revolution, to better understand why the revolution was necessary and the society that exists today. I read Race in Cuba by Esteban Morales Dominguez, who participated, an African in Cuba who participated in the revolution, because I wanted to hear what an actual revolutionary had to say about race in Cuba, because, you know, the gusanos come in all flavors these days. And so I spent the whole year reading, listening to music. I got a Spanish tutor, because I was like, when I go over there, I want to be able to communicate with people directly. And then obviously big shout out to Onyesunwu, who's part of the A-APRP. I feel like she's one of my greatest teachers on Cuba, and one of the greatest propagandists on behalf of Cuba that is in the States today. Like, because there's a lot of people that try to take lukewarm positions on it, right? Like people are like, well, I'm going to be balanced, I'm going to be fair. That's not what the current moment calls for. The current moment calls for you to be all in. And I feel like Onya is a great example of that. So mentally, spiritually, I've been like trying to get myself there and all year, and I've pulled it off physically. I got there. Before we got a chance to go to Cuba, we had to spend 3 days in Miami, which was interesting because, you know, Miami is basically the breeding ground for reactionaries of all diasporas, not just the Cuban diaspora, the Venezuelan diaspora, the Nicaraguan diaspora. Like, if there are reactionaries to be had, they are absolutely in Miami. And so there was a lot of safety precautions that we had to take, being a group of people that were in support of the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban people while we were there. But our time in Miami was necessary, because when you take a group of people out of the United States and into a revolutionary society, there is a level of preparation that has to be done. You can't just dump people from this individualist, you know, reactionary, capitalist, me dominated society and expect them to understand the reality in a socialist society. So we needed 3 days to where people were prepped on the history of Cuba, the events of the Cuban Revolution, what is socialism, you know, and also just some time to interrogate some of the like ugliness that you sort of adapt living in the belly of the beast, right? Like the tourism industry, all these things they tell you when you go places, you're there on vacation. A book called A Small Place, one of the things that the book talks about is like how people leave the US or Europe and they go to global South countries, and they're there and like the sun is supposed to shine perfectly every day. You know, the people there are supposed to have all the coconuts and the plantains ready for you, and the water's supposed to be perfectly blue. And if it rains, it's an imposition on your vacation. It's like, no, you have to eliminate all those ways of thinking from people's minds, especially when you are taking people from the United States to visit Cuba, a country, like bringing them from the country that is currently blockading the country where people are. You have to help people lift the blinds on that and kind of wipe that capitalist, you know, dirt off of people's brains. So that's what we spent doing 3 days in Miami. And then, one more thing I want to say about that. On the news, when you watch the news and you hear about Miami, you hear about all these reactionaries that want regime change and military intervention into Cuba, and they hate the revolution and they hate socialism, and da 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 da. Well, actually, I had the opportunity of getting the chance to meet some really kind and loving and brilliant revolutionary diasporans in the Miami community who, while they are outnumbered, are still very proud of Cuba. They're proud of Latin America. They're proud of Nicaragua, proud of Venezuela, and they want to support each other's revolutionary projects. And they housed us, they fed us, they kept us safe. They tried to fight people in the airport for us when they was talking shit and getting too close. You know, just little aunties trying to get scrappy in the it was cool. It's beautiful because that's not the depiction that you get of expats in Miami ever.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that you also hear in relation to like Cuba is, you know, oh, it's extremely racist and, you know, whatever, right? Knowing that racism is a global phenomenon as well, but knowing that the Cuban government and people are doing things and trying to make strides to, you know, eradicate, you know, racism. So I guess if you want to talk about your experience with that, essentially, what you came across, and maybe anything else in relation to any other reactionary talking points that you like to dispel that you may experience out there.
It's important for people to understand that living in the U.S., like you can't talk about Cuba without first talking about Africa. Everything that the U.S. and the global North are is because of the theft of African resources and African people, not even just like in the historical sense, but y'all are in the party. Y'all know we talk about this all the time. Everything from the gas in people's cars, the coltan and the cobalt in our phones and computers, chromes on our rims, diamonds in our ears. All this is because of the continued theft of African resources. And then that is also sort of in return facilitated by force through operations like AFRICOM. Cuba as an island has a history of brutal slavery tied to the sugar industry, which is why I recommend people do read Race to Revolution by Gerald Horne, because you get an understanding, right, of what Cuba was like during its period of slavery. Slavery in Cuba was incredibly brutal, like so much so that historians point to plantation owners that would leave the U.S. and visit Cuba, visit their plantations, because another thing people don't understand about Cuba is that a vast majority of the plantations that were owned there were owned by North American slave owners. So when you see these gusanos in Miami acting crazy about how they want their land back, it turns into Inception a little bit when you start to understand that they are the children and the grandchildren of North American slave owners. But I say that to say, it was incredibly brutal. African people did not, you typically live to even be 30 there, because they will work to death, all to uphold the sugar industry, right? And so many people were imported onto the island of Cuba. It's actually a fascinating sort of push and pull. It's the same thing that happened in many Caribbean countries. The Europeans knew that they were bringing too many Africans into one location, and they feared Africanization. They feared revolt and uprising, but they could not satisfy their hunger for profits. So it's like they're having these nightmares of Africans taking over the island, but they keep importing more Africans. They keep importing more Africans, up until the extent that at one point in time, Cuba is like 70% African. And so what you have is a situation where Europeans from the mainland are going to Cuba, they're looking around and they're like, not only do y'all have mad Africans on this island, I don't actually trust the non-Africans either. Like everything here is tainted with the stench of Africa. That's how they write about Cuba. They're like, even like they already thought the Spanish were like greasy and dirty. And then the Spanish start having children of their own who are now these like Cubans. But then they're also mixed with these Africans. And so everybody on the island has this, they got this little African thing about them that the mainlanders don't really like or trust. And so that leads sort of into the development of Cuba and Cuban culture. So I say all this to say that like you got to be clear that post-revolution, the US and Cuba have followed two very different trajectories when it comes to how they want to rectify that past of slavery. Cuba is a country that has already had three revolutions. You had the Spanish, you had the war against the Spanish, you had the war against the war. Sorry, they've already had the war against the Spanish, and they've already had their war, the revolution of 59, right? And also, I'm sorry, I left out the most important, which is the war that the Africans themselves launched to free themselves from slavery. That's 3 revolutions at this point that African people in Cuba have participated in. And so post-revolution, you have an island that is grappling with the fact that everything that they are is because of Africa. And this is Fidel's historic stance on African people and Africa as a nation. Cuba is what it is because of Africa. That sentiment very much still holds true in the people today, right? I met people in Cuba who in the United States would not be considered Black because, you know, we love our one drop rule stuff, but they will tell you with a straight face, Africa is in me, you know, like Africano, like they will tell you that because they understand everything about them culturally, the food they eat, the music that they listen to, the dances that they partake in. Culturally, for something to everything considered Cuban is African. There, you cannot like make that distinction. And on a material level, Cuba is constantly reckoning with that. They're constantly trying to make more space in their public domain for Africa, for discourse on Africa and recognition of the Africanity of Cuba, I would say. Why does this matter? This matters because you can't make blanket statements about claiming to love Black people or respect Black people if you don't love or respect Africa, point blank, period. It's not possible. It's not possible just to be like, we love Black people, but you have 30-something military bases across the continent of Africa that are looting resources and suppressing revolutionary movements. It's not possible. So when you hold up Cuba and the US side by side, the contexts are completely different, meaning you can't talk about race the same because you have a island full of people who are on a structural level recognize that Africa is a part of their identity and have fought a revolution to free their African population fought a revolution to free themselves, to free the society and bring about the implementation of socialism. They're already a step ahead of the discourse in the US just off that alone. But then Cuba is a nation that sent medical assistance and had people die. They spilled blood in Africa. So I say all that to say some of the things that I'm going to say are going to be difficult for people who don't understand this to hear, because we're taught that in North America, the United States particularly, we have the last say on race. We have the one analysis of race that matters, but I had to challenge myself a lot in Cuba to understand the relationship that exists there. So one of the things that's being used in the United States is this claim that we should be wary with our support of the Cuban Revolution because Cuba is racist and socialism and communism can't fix racism. That's something, I don't know, the Afro-pessimists, I guess they have the answer, even though they'll tell you they don't have answers. But scientifically, as a Pan-Africanist, right, what I understand is that it's more nuanced, as they like to say, than that, right? There are the people of Cuba, especially the Africans, absolutely will tell you that there are still racist attitudes that exist in Cuba. There are still racist people that they contend with on a daily basis, and that those things absolutely do have impacts on their lives. But is Cuba a racist society? Meaning, is structurally baked into the DNA of the society post-revolution? Is Cuba a racist society? Does it bar African people from access to homes, from access to medical care, from access to education? Are African people being gunned down in the streets by a racist police force that exists to protect private property? The answer is just objectively no. It is an emphatic no. This is not the case. Now we can talk a little bit more about racism, right? So one of the things that has created inequality in Cuba that people don't necessarily like to talk about with nuance. They just go, well, Africans in Cuba are still doing bad. Okay, let's talk about why. One of those examples of a thing that is an individual sort of racist holdover from the colonial period and from the beginning of the revolution. When you look at Miami and you see the Gusanos, the people who are there screaming, we want Cuba back, they're white. They're white people, mostly. They have found a handful of Black Gusanos that they can lift up in recent years, but the vast majority of those people are white. Meaning when Fidel and the Communist Party of Cuba, the July 26 movement, had successfully implemented agrarian reform, land reform, right? Where they were saying, you can't own all these plantations anymore. You can't own all of this. You can't own all these fields and plantations. These things have to be equally divided among the population. Those who controlled those things left and they went to Miami. Okay, so now you have a society that since the fall of the Soviet Union has not the fall, the intentional dismantling, and we need to be honest about that too, dismantling of the Soviet Union. Cuba struggled during what it was called the special period with reorganizing its society because it had become somewhat reliant on support from the Soviet Union. And you can compare the special period to the sort of tough time that Cuba is in right now. One thing that has historically been a saving grace for Cuban people has been remittances on the island coming from your family in the States. Well, the vast majority of African Cubans still live in Cuba. They never left the island. Therefore, they don't have access to US dollar that they can send back to their family members. White Cubans can do those things. White Cubans in Miami can send money back to their white family in Cuba, which creates somewhat of an inequality, right? Because they have access to that US dollar, which is sort of, has been historically the driver of the world economy, and Africans have not. That is not the Cuban government saying we're going to redline and prison industrial complex you into the ground. That is just a consequential inequality of the blockade, of the United States blockade. So you can't even talk about inequality among Africans and non-Africans in Cuba without acknowledging things like that. But the Cuban government has gone a long way to try to rectify its colonial past, much further than the United States has or ever will, in my opinion. But Africans in Cuba will tell you that Cuba still has a long way to go. The difference, and this is a thing that a lot of people don't want to hear, is that Africans in Cuba actually live in a democratic society where they can organize around the things that they want and need implemented, and see those things implemented into a state protected process. The United States offers us no such thing. If anything, they are constantly telling us to shut the fuck up, right? They're telling us to shut the fuck up, or they're like tokenizing us and giving us Barack, giving us Kamala, wearing kente cloth and kneeling, doing performative things that don't address any of the structural issues. But as it relates to issues in Cuba that still exist, like addiction, domestic violence, disability, the state, because the people are the state, you cannot separate the state from the people because the people are the state. So that means the state is disabled people. The state is African people. The state is women. So when those needs need to be addressed, there is a direct mechanism to address them. I'm sorry for this really long answer to your question, but I always want to make sure people understand that I'm not trying to make excuses or tell you that there is no such thing as racism in Cuba, but I need you to understand the way that it's going to get addressed there has nothing to do with your Twitter thread. You're not moving the needle on anything. Your Instagram posts aren't moving the needle on anything. The Cuban government doesn't owe you shit. It doesn't have to change policies or economic decisions just because you say it does. What you can do in terms of positionality where you are is pressure the government where you live to end the blockade. Because I can promise you, based on the levels of intense organization that I've seen in Cuba, I've seen African people sit at the head of their disability organizations, their women's rights organizations, their youth organizations, their labor organizing organizations. When Cuba is free of the blockade and it has access to trade and resources with other people in the world, it already has the structures in place to solve the problems that you're worried about. They will solve them so fast, your head is going to spin living in a country that has not figured out how to respect you for 500 years. So that's my thoughts on the conversation about race in Cuba.
Fire.
Thank you. So I actually wanted to have a conversation around the contrast between life in Cuba and what's been most recently happening in this country. So there was I guess last weekend, there was the march that was through, I guess, they used to be called Vanguard America, but they're currently the Patriot Front, and the Vanguard America splintered off, and that was the group where the dude hit and killed Heather Heyer. So they all splintered off, and now there is a one group called Patriot Front, which is led, or one of the leaders is Patrick Rousseau, and he's sort of a huge spokesperson. And I just wanted to sort of contrast the attitudes people have in this country, particularly Europeans, with what you're seeing in Cuba. So people in particular, when Trump was in the White House, people, oh, this is not my country. Oh, there's a rise in all of these movements happening. I'm ashamed of my country, all of this. And we all understand this sort of organizing has been happening for years. The foundation of this country is based on that type of organizing. And Europeans didn't have to see it. And if they did, it was easy for them to ignore because they were not personally affected by it. They were not personally, in general, affected by police terrorism. They were not, in general, affected by localized colonialism, aka gentrification, because they may have actually been the ones performing it. So they didn't have to see all this stuff around them because there was an enclave of the four walls of either their house or the enclave of the four walls of their perception of America. And so now, of course, there's the whole issue with the abortion ban in Texas. And so people are worried about that. And my response is, imperialism affects reproductive rights all over the world where African people are. How is what's happening in Texas any different than where your tax dollars are going? So I think this conversation, people are acting as if this is new. And I'm like, why are you upset now? And so the individualism that we are trained to have via this capitalism is being seen when we're seeing these types of groups marching, and people are like, oh, it's a rise, it's a rise. So there was a video of this group marching, the Patriot Front, and a woman was yelling, it was a European woman yelling, get out of this country if you don't like it. And that just made me laugh because, first of all, this isn't your country. So I know it was a play on, people telling Africans or folks who are anti-capitalist, et cetera, you don't like this country, if you complain, love it or leave it. But this idea that, again, an American identity is based on just being born and living here. And we have to understand that American identity is first and foremost political and ideological. And so we have to have a land analysis, we have to have a gender analysis, we have to have a class analysis with all of this. So with your experience with Cuba, all of that is happening. And then there is a quote from Patrick Rousseau, and I wanted to have a conversation around that because it heavily contrasts what is happening in Cuba. So what Patrick Rousseau says is, quote, "Our demonstrations are an exhibition of our unified capability to organize, to show our strength, not as brawlers or public nuisances, but as men capable of illustrating a message and seeking an America that more closely resembles the interests of its true people." So that is the quote from Patrick Rousseau. And of course, as these folks are marching, they have a uniform. So it's like khakis and like dark shirts, and then they're wearing plastic shin guards because, well, we don't know, we're anticipating violence. And so just in that quote and all of these actions and what we're seeing with not necessarily the rise of these organizations happening, but just the outwardness of the organizations happening. So I think it's important to have that conversation around dissecting the colonialism and even the de facto or silent support of the colonialism when people say, this is not my country, etc. So dissecting the colonialism and that, the white supremacy, which is of course connected and rooted with that settler colonialism that exists in the US, in Israel, in Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, etc., and the patriarchy around that quote and the ableism and all of these things versus, again, what you've seen in Cuba and the people you spoke with and the organizing you're seeing happening there.
Yeah, so on the tip about that front, those unfortunate people marching around, making that connection to the abortion rights thing is really interesting because I think the American population is just greatly miseducated about what's happening here and what's always been happening here. So we are spinning on this rat wheel of democracy where we are convincing ourselves that by electing more people into the colonial apparatus, by getting more representation into the colonial apparatus, that we're somehow going to repress these people, right? Like, if we just vote harder, show up, meet you, get to know your representative or something like that, like we're just going to be able to every 4 years vote to protect voting rights and abortion rights. And these people are just going to be so embarrassed that they're going to have to go back to living in the shadows the way that I want them to. That is not realistic. That's not. And I think going to Cuba showed me that. Like, I always understood that the revolution was necessary, but you really feel it because those types of people can't exist in a society like Cuba. That is why they're in Miami. Like, I don't think people understand that. Y'all not asking the right questions. Why did they leave? And how did they find themselves to be so comfortable amongst that community? Like, you look at those people, they're right-wing reactionaries and they all have the same agenda. Like, they could be marching about their united front one day and then be talking about SOS Cuba the next day because the causes are connected. That cannot exist in Cuba. And something that another reason why people have to understand, another thing people have to understand, the reason why figures like Fidel Castro, the reason why figures like Thomas Sankara, the reason why figures like Amilcar Cabral, hell, even the reason why figures like Joseph Stalin are so disliked in the United States is because they are people who took revolution, the concept of revolution, and like made it real and like made somebody pay and like made some people have to leave and made people give up things and made some people have to give up their reactionary ass lives in the process. Because you like this we keep trying to exist on this dichotomy where it's like we can have a perfect world full of reactionaries. No, we cannot. Either people have to be re-educated or they have to be like removed. I'm gonna put it like that. They have to be re-educated or they have to be removed, because what you have in Cuba is a society where people are not voting every 4 years to protect fucking abortion rights. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. People are not voting every 4 years to protect the right to vote. That's madness. It doesn't make sense. You cannot leave those kinds of decisions in the hands of a reactionary class of your society. You have to suppress them. That's what the Cuban Revolution was all about, was suppressing revolutionaries. It was telling them, get on board with the revolution or get in a boat and go to Miami. And they got in the boat and they went to Miami, and they're going to have to live with that for the rest of their lives. But getting back to the point that I was making, in Cuba, people are not gathering around to vote on basic things like this. Like the right to education is not something that you vote about. You're a human. It's a human right that you be educated. So you go get educated. You're a human. It's a human right that you have a home. So you always have a home, no matter what. You're a human. You have the right to proper health care, regardless of whether or not you have a job or not. So you go to the fucking hospital. These are not things to vote about. There's no such thing as voting for Medicaid. That's what the revolution was for. So that you're not voting over these stupid, silly things like this. The conversations that people are having in Cuban society right now are much more elevated than that. I'll give you an example. One of the things that as a society they're currently discussing is this thing called the family code. So after the revolution, basically the Communist Party, the July 26th movement, all these people folded under one banner that created the state, and they created a definition of what constituted a family. And the reason why they did this was because they wanted to codify into law that it should not be legal or morally accepted, like culturally within Cuban culture, for there to be responsibilities of a man versus a woman in the household, and when those responsibilities are divided up for whatever reason, the woman should not be left holding the majority of the work in the household. So how do we think about what a family is and what are the responsibilities that a family shares? Well, in 2021, Cuban people really appreciate the family code. That's like great. We love that. We love this structural acknowledgement of, like, patriarchal practices in the home, but also can we push this further? Because how are you guys defining a family? Is a family a man and a woman and their son and daughter? Can a family be two women? And if so, what does the family code say about that? Can a family be two men? Can the family be a grandma so they're having these conversations as a society out in the open. They have all these forums and these channels to have these conversations. The conversation isn't, should women submit to men? The conversation isn't, should women be allowed to get rid of a pregnancy, and when should they be able to do that? And does it have to be the result of a sexual? Like, these are backwards ass conversations that should have been left in like 1800. Cubans are like, we're past that. Like, we trying to move this conversation into the future. So it's depressing to see all these open air community conversations, like people just outside on the block having this conversation, and then come back to the United States and we're still talking about whether or not Black people have the right to vote. It's ridiculous. It's silly.
Man, yes. You spit right now. But I know we were talking before this, in relation to like the level of community you've seen, when you're out there. I don't know if you kind of just want to elaborate on that a little bit more, just for the broader audience about that when you're out in Cuba.
About what one more time?
The level of community you have seen out there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So to talk about the community that exists in Cuba, I'll give an example of mask. So Cuba was hit hard during the pandemic, and still they managed to organize the needs of their society around human life. So in areas like there's a province that we went to called Matanzas. It was the hardest hit in Cuba because Cuba tried to open up its tourism sector briefly during the pandemic to, of course, stimulate economy, to stimulate life for people in Cuba, and it backfired because, dirty ass people from the global north came and brought hella virus with them, and it decimated Matanzas. But in a matter of weeks, in a matter of months, Matanzas was able to get a handle on their outbreaks, to the extent that sorry, I'm gonna back up even further. So you know how in the United States, when the pandemic kicked off, we shut down for like a week and a half, right? Since this pandemic started, Cuba has been shut down. This is at the desire and this is at the desires of the people who are the state. In order to shut down a society to get a virus under control, though, you have to provide a safety net for people. This is what leftists in the United States have been talking about since the beginning of the pandemic. You can't tell people to stay home without offering them something to stay home for. So while we've been over here fighting to get stimulus checks, unions in Cuba began organizing around subsidies for workers in certain industries. So if you were a bartender, if you were a theater performer, if you owned a nightclub or a restaurant, you were a waiter or a waitress, and the government is saying restaurants are closed, y'all not coming out to no club and shaking your ass, everybody go home. Well, then the people who make their living facilitating people eating in restaurants and shaking their ass in the club at night, they subsidize their livings because the unions came together to say, hey, this is how you have to protect our people. So people were getting as much as like 60% of their regular pay to stay the fuck home, right? So starting there, you create a level of seriousness in the population about this pandemic. But also people understand people just can't be dying because we need each other here to survive. So that creates within the people a consciousness that I need to wear my fucking mask. So when you are in the streets of Cuba, all you see is people with their mask on. It's not something to argue about. It's not something to debate about. There are no people getting platformed on television for saying that the mask is like some kind of mind control or something like that. That's silly. It's ridiculous. And I tried to talk to some Cubans that I met about how we were experiencing this, and they were very confused. Because their whole thing is just you wear your mask to keep your friends alive. You wear your mask to keep your grandma alive. So people could be walking in the streets by themselves, not even close to anybody. They have a mask on. We had an encounter on our caravan where some of the North Americans that we brought to Cuba decided they were going to walk around in Cuba with no mask on. Cuban police approached them, did not beat them or like arrest them. They literally just handed them masks. They were just like, here. They didn't even say like, why don't you have on a mask? They were like, hey, here's a mask. I see you don't have one. Here's a mask. Like a very simple approach that all Cubans have taken. That actually happened on multiple occasions. You pull up somewhere around Cubans and you don't have a mask, people are going to give you one. And it's not like to antagonize you or, make you feel stupid, but it's just like, you don't have a mask on, I have one, here's one, right? So I'm saying all of this to sort of emphasize community during the pandemic. Another thing that happened, Cuban children have been out of school since the pandemic started, because the idea of sending your young people into schools in the middle of a pandemic is unspeakable in a society that is built around human life. That is like the number one thing that you won't do. Even if we're going to exploit the parents, we can't exploit the children, y'all. So how did the Cuban state respond to that? An example of that I talked to a woman who was explaining to us, well, all of the children had to stay home, but some children are in positions that where they would have been more prone to being behind. How would we address that? What the state did was, they know everybody doesn't have iPads in their homes. They know everybody doesn't have computers in their homes. So they use the one thing that they know everybody has to supplement the kids' education. Everybody has televisions. We have a number of television channels in this country. Instead of y'all running dumb shit, borderline pornography, propaganda, and all the other shit that comes on TV in the United States, we're going to dedicate a channel per grade level for the children of our country. So your kids can wake up in the morning, You're already home because we subsidizing your living to stay there. Cut on the damn TV and let your kids watch it, get their education. And hey, there's plenty of people in the home to assist children who need help with that, who need help with what they're seeing on screen. To push that even further, there are some people in Cuba who could not stay home because they have essential job functions, right? What the CDRs are, and I'll explain what CDRs are briefly, the Committees in Defense of the Revolution. When the revolution overtook Cuba, Fidel figured out, and Che too, from reading and understanding communist theory in the mass line, that you cannot sustain a revolution that the people do not feel involved in, or that the people do not feel the direct hand in. So they created this thing called the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. What the committees are just everyday people on a block by block basis that are the wheel that keep the revolution turning. So when food distribution needs to happen, when dissemination of medical supplies, when there are domestic violence situations in which somebody needs to be removed from the home, there is a structure in your community. The person above you or next door can give you information, can give you resources, because these are the people that keep the wheels turning. What the committees did in every community was they created WhatsApp groups for all moms with children in similar grade levels. In those groups, the moms have been able to communicate about their kids' schoolwork, the things that are being sent to them by the schools, like long distance or virtually, that's what I'm looking for, virtually or whatever. And if you have a child and you can't stay home to help them, there are moms in your community. There are dads in your community. There's your CDRs that will make sure your children don't fall behind. So the basis of the Cuban Revolution is community. Onye, from the New Mexico chapter of the A-APRP, she's always talking about how people talk about revolutions as like this thing that men just do with guns. That's not, like, Cuba shows you that's not how this works. The thing that's keeping the Cuban Revolution going is little old aunties, like women who look like our grandma, like you're a librarian, you know what I mean? They are like studied on communist theory. They are proud of the revolution. They are empowered. Some of them are armed in their homes where necessary, and they are the people who are responsible for making sure in moments like this where there are food shortages, they're walking around with eggs in the street like this, going door to door. Hey, do y'all have food? They're walking around with bread, with water, to make sure people have clean water in their homes. They are the wheels of the revolution. There is no revolution without these people, without these CDRs. These are the people who are looking out of their windows and making sure y'all not circled up in the street trying to do some counter-revolutionary activity. It's not some, policeman walking around with like a bazooka getting ready to blow your head off. It's your neighbors pulling you in and being like, hey, I know times are hard right now. I know that these electricity blackouts are making you want to go out in the street and scream SOS Cuba. Let's talk about it. What do you need? What do you need to be satisfied? What do you need to fucking relax, right? Your CDR is the person who knows everybody in your area who's been vaccinated, who's still waiting to get vaccinated, who can get what vaccine based on any pre-existing medical conditions. This is all basic knowledge from everyday people who are responsible for moving the revolution forward. So when we say you can't separate Cuban people from the state, it's because they are the state. No such thing exists in the United States. Think about all the reactionary approaches that we've had to the pandemic, the hoarding, the individualizing of the vaccine, of the pandemic of the unvaccinated, the victim blaming, calling African people stupid for not trusting the medical system. These things are foreign to Cuban people. I asked an African, this is the last thing I'll say about this. I asked an African journalist that I got to spend a lot of time with there, who has become somewhat like a friend. I asked her if, when the vaccine was announced, if she felt any hesitation about taking it. And her response to me was, why would I be hesitant? The vaccine is a gift of the revolution. That just goes to show you how the people there think of the thing that they're building and sustaining.
Yes, I wanted to actually sit with the vaccine issue, because we understand that everything is political, but there's the dialectics to looking at the vaccine as being political. And so when your comrade says the vaccine is a gift of the revolution, and then you're seeing, as you mentioned, people here individualizing the situation and saying that vaccine is Marxism or it's taking away my individual rights, how do we discuss the dialectics of that? Because, you know, people say, oh, people are making vaccines a political issue, but at the same time it is. So how do we navigate this discussion where, you know, looking at the issue of vaccine imperialism, where there are people around the world who do not have access to vaccines because the Gates Foundation, et cetera, are looking at patents and going, okay, well, intellectual property, so you cannot have this. And I honestly, this is just Jamilah's opinion, when Bill Gates, I think it was the TED Talk, when he talked about vaccines and the population or whatever, I really do think it's not a matter of vaccinating people as the cause of that, the population. I think it's the withholding of the vaccines. I think that was the unspoken aspect of what Bill Gates was talking about, because that is what the Gates Foundation actually has done in real time. So I do think that, you know, and even in some areas, I remember there being vaccines. I don't think necessarily in this current pandemic, but there have been vaccines that have been left to sit and be out of date. And, you know, so there are all these issues. And even the WHO is complaining about the US and vaccine hoarding. So if you can have the World Health Organization, which isn't particularly anti-imperialist or anything, but even when you have organizations like that saying, you know, it's a problem when you're withholding these vaccines, there are people around the world, and then looking at people who actually do have access saying, well, it's taking away my individual rights. And there are people in the global South, if you will, who are like, hey, we need them. So it is a political issue, but at the same time, again, when people say don't make it a political issue, let's discuss that a little bit, because I agree with the context of what they're saying. At the same time, it is. So yes, let's discuss that.
So one of the things that I really wanted to come back and brag a lot about Cuba's vaccination efforts, because despite the many challenges of the blockade, despite not even having syringes at one point in time because of the blockade, having 5 vaccines but not having enough syringes to vaccinate their population, Cuba has pulled it off. And like I said, they vaccinated 90% of their population. There are some areas of Cuba where no one has died from the coronavirus in like 30, 45 days. There have been no new diagnoses, period, in 3 days. Well, that was the stats when I was there. I'm not sure if those numbers continued since I've left. But that feat is incredible, and it deserves to be discussed and praised. But that is also a very easily liberalized talking point, right? Because to talk about the vaccination efforts in Cuba in the grand scheme of the pandemic, without talking about the social, the scientific social safety net structure that exists underneath those vaccines, is to undercut the entire conversation. Just again, to force a conversation about vaccines one more time. What you have to understand is that everybody in the United States could get vaccinated, but without any of the additional public health measures that exist, all the virus is going to do is just like mutate and transform while we continue to hang out with each other and drink and go out and just like call ourselves Moderna mommies and Pfizer poppies on Twitter. That shit was so lame. I'm so glad we're out of that time period. But
I never heard of that.
Oh my God, you're so lucky.
You're so lucky. Not on Twitter. That's the thing.
Yeah, people are so corny, bro. Yeah. People are so corny. But we ended up in the global north making being vaccinated a personality trait, when, like you were saying, there were people who were looking for the vaccine in global south countries where it was being hoarded. But to go back to Cuba for a second, the reason why they have been able to turn around vaccination efforts and protect their people so well in the pandemic is because they already had the infrastructure in place to deal with these things. The Cuban healthcare model is not a model based on solely treatment. It's based on preventative care. You don't have all this access to all the medicines and all the equipment in the world. So you have to keep your population as healthy as you can outside of times of crisis, right? And then also, because people aren't excluded from the healthcare system because of finances, then you already have an infrastructure to reach people. You already have family doctors that live next door to you in your community who understands your entire medical history. They know that your dad was an alcoholic, your mom's side of the family is prone to like cancer. They know about your diet. They know that you smoke cigarettes. And then you have the polyclinics in your area where if your family doctor can't handle it, you can get recommended directly to the polyclinic. The family doctor's diagnosis and their expertise are moving back and forth between the polyclinic and you. If you need some kind of specialized surgery, they can level you up to another institution, but the entire time your family doctor is in the loop of what's happening between these three institutions. What they have is a network of people who can reach people. So when it's time to vaccinate people, your family doctor already has a roster of people that they can talk to who already trust them because the person's been taking care of everybody in their family since their grandma. You know what I mean? There's already an infrastructure of, we know who all lives here, who has what pre-existing conditions. We don't need to do a survey and find these things out. The infrastructure is already there. We don't have the time to start from scratch every time. This is the same thing with their responses to natural disasters as well, right? Like there's training that happens on a regular basis to prepare people to, if you have to pack up all your stuff because a hurricane is coming, let's practice that. What's the route? Where are you going? Right? Also, we'll make sure we pay for you to leave, because we know that's what that's like in the US. They keep telling people to leave, but they don't ever give anybody resources to do that. I'm sorry that I'm like a little bit all over the place, but I'm just trying to drive home the point that like the infrastructure, it already exists. It already existed before the pandemic. So all that they had to focus on was creating the vaccines. That's it. They didn't have to worry about enrolling people into medical plans, making sure people had insurance so they could tell who could go where and who could get what. They didn't have to do any of those things. The infrastructure already existed. They made the vaccines. They came up with a one straight message. In the US, at first they told us, don't get no mask. Then it was like, oh, maybe you should get masks. Like we had all these conflicting messages that created all the space for confusion. Now you got the Reddit people talking about his mind control, and then colonized communities already don't trust medical experimentation from the government to begin with. How the fuck do you allow a company like Johnson & Johnson to be the face of a life-saving medication in the middle of a pandemic when we know companies like Johnson & Johnson have been in and out of court for decades for their use of carcinogens in baby powder, right? So you already have all these conflicting messages, all this space to brew confusion. No, the infrastructure was there. They created the vaccines. They came up with one message: wear y'all mask, stay home. We're working on a vaccine. When it's available, come get it. And when it became available, and throughout the duration of the pandemic, that message was consistent. It was clear, coming from the president down to the CDR on your block. Put your mask on, stay home, and when the vaccine is available, we're going to make sure everybody gets it. And not only that, we're going to prioritize elderly people. We're going to prioritize disabled people. We're going to prioritize anybody that is vulnerable to this moment. And they work their way up to this moment where 90% of the population is vaccinated. But I just don't want people to get lost on the like, well, they vaccinated in Cuba. You don't want to get vaccinated. It's not just that. It's the superstructure that underlays all of that. And even with the vaccines that they were able to create, the 5 vaccines that they were able to create, you also have to, this is a little complicated and a lot of people don't want to get into this conversation, but in the United States, because we have a for-profit model, it was profitable for our pharmaceutical companies to pursue the approach of creating these mRNA vaccines that they had to then break down and explain to the general population. Cuba has a template for how you make vaccines. It's not any less safe or more safe than the ones that we have, but it's a template that's been explained to the population since the beginning of the revolution. And it's effective. It works. It's not as complicated. It's no new technology that's going to get sold on the market, but they did what worked. And they were able to create enough of them that they were able to share with other countries in the global South, because the United States, Europe, Canada, all these European children of the world, they were hoarding. They were preventing people, and not even hoarding, they tested these vaccines on populations of people in Africa, in Asia, and then restricted their access to them when they became formulated and available on the market. Just devilish shit. But yeah, I say all that to say you can't talk about the vaccination efforts in Cuba without talking about the superstructure that existed underneath all of it.
My thing is, I wanted to know, like, what is the sentiments around a lot of the U.S. propaganda, state propaganda with SOS Cuba and everything like that, and a lot of stuff we see here in the West. Like, what was the consensus down there, at least from what you've seen in relation to that? Like, are they privy to what's going on and what's being told in the U.S.? And have you seen anything, in relation to the propaganda, like manifest or anything like that while you're out there?
Yeah. So the day that we got there was November 15th. The day that socialism was supposed to be brought to its knees by the CIA, I guess, and their Twitter bots. I don't know. Like I told you earlier, it made no noise, not a peep, because one, the people are not interested in these narratives, these victim narratives, because when you attack the Cuban Revolution, you are attacking them. The revolution is their work. So when you say Cuba is a failing country, you're saying the things you're saying to them, the things that I'm doing, the processes that I'm participating in every day are a failure. Fuck you. That's literally how they feel. And then second of all, this is the thing that people don't like to hear, but when you make a revolution, you have to defend it. They're not going out like that. So yeah, they are looking out for counter-revolutionary activity because they're going to stomp it out. And counter-revolutionaries on the island are incredibly outnumbered because the vast majority of the people there support their revolutionary process and they want the opportunity to bring it to fruition. So they are aware definitely of the propaganda that exists here in the United States, and they've had to find really creative ways to respond to it. So the Latin Grammys happened while we were over there. So they heard about them, those groups, those musicians going on stage and talking about SOS Cuba and all this kind of stuff. And it actually really sucks to them that this stuff gets the amount of attention that it does. But also, I think one of the things that's kind of scary to me, one of the things that gives me a little bit of urgency in coming back to the United States, young people are definitely at the forefront of the Cuban Revolution. I want to put that out there. They are some of the ones on the island who are saying, not only do I support the socialist project that exists here, but I want us to go further. I'm willing to give up more for us to do more socialism, for us to have to do less economic reforms. I'm willing to live. This is crazy because young people in the United States would never, but they're saying I'm willing to give up more in order to further this socialist revolution. But what you have on the island is a budding generation of Cuban children who will never get the chance to meet Fidel, who for them, access to healthcare, education, housing, those are human rights. I can't even believe y'all spend so much time talking about these things like they're life-changing and incredible. I've always had that since I was born. What else? What else can I get from this lifetime of sacrifice? I like to compare a little bit to how Africans in the US feel when people are constantly beating us over the head with like civil rights era discourse. Even though the Cuban Revolution is not the civil rights movement, it's just, I'm drawing the comparison to say, I get so fucking sick and tired of people telling me about the fact that I got the right to vote in bourgeois elections. I don't care. That's how a lot of youth in Cuba feel. Yeah, I have a house I don't have to pay for. I can just go to school, and if I get sick, I can go to the doctor. That's the way things are supposed to be. I get on my phone or I turn on the TV and I see these American kids wearing the latest fashions. I see these music videos where these girls have these like this cool hair. The guys have these like cool sneakers. They like travel around. I'm on Instagram. I see them traveling around the world with their friends. They like have passports that work. When am I going to get a chance to live like that? Right. And it's a desire driven by capitalist infiltration on the island, but it's also fair. It's also like a human response, right? Why do I have to exist on this island for the sake of this project where I have to eat bread and eggs every day, where sometimes in the summer there's no electricity and it's fucking hot? Why do I have to live in this existence where I'm being punished every day just for being a Cuban? I didn't ask for this. I didn't sign up for this. And so there's a frustration that exists within a pocket of the population that's tired, that's just literally tired. They don't see a way out. They don't see the blockade ever being lifted. And so for them, everything that comes from the government is propaganda. So they don't want to watch the news. They want to get all their news from WhatsApp and Facebook, right? And what that does is bring them closer and closer to the reactionaries, because y'all already know how they do on WhatsApp. You already know how they do on Facebook, right? No kind of historic study, rigor, nothing, lies and vibes and feelings. And that's where a lot of them are getting their information. And so the government is having to go out of their way to ensure that young people are not being left out of the revolutionary process at every level. And also that they are getting information about the revolution that is factual, right? Because now it's very easy just to say Fidel Castro was a bad man, and Che Guevara killed a lot of people, and nobody ever has to explain to you what any of that is about. And so they're having to create institutions that are interactive, that feel like fun learning, so that the youth are engaged in the learning of their own history. So yeah, I say it's not all the youth. Most of the youth are like, I love this thing. I'm willing to die for this thing. Count me in. Like, but all Cubans have to have, this is something that I heard while I was there. All Cubans have to have their moment where they feel like they have contributed to the struggle toward their revolution. So there's a generation of Cubans on the island that fought the revolution. There's a generation of Cubans on the island that lived through the special period and saw what that was like. And now there's this new generation that's living through the pandemic and the intensified Trump and Biden sanctions on the island. And this is going to be their story to tell.
I want to address the very nature of everything we talk about, the one word, organization. So getting back to, people sort of lamenting the problem, saying, well, I don't know, as an individual, I don't know if I can do anything, people feeling helpless. But again, people you think are the problem are actually organizing. So in order to come to a solution, that's what you need to do. And that is what you're seeing, even looking at a process of criticism over the years in the Cuban Revolution, looking at, okay, we have this issue of the pandemic. So the pandemic obviously doesn't see culture, if you're we don't see racism, pandemic doesn't see any of that. It affects the whole world, which is why it's called the pandemic. But when we're seeing how capitalist countries have responded or reacted to it, and how more socialist leaning countries or socialist or communist governments have responded to it. And when you're saying that, well, we're not going to put kids back in school kids spread germs, etc. What did they do? Okay, we have TV stations. So addressing what the problem is with an action that is organized, and then having communities build networks. I think that is a major factor in organization. And so looking at the similarities between revolutionary nationalist movements or communist or socialist leading governments, organization is the key. And then we're looking at the movements that are happening here. So that is the one. But when we look at the glaring and the vast contrast, and those glaring and vast contrasts include, but they're not limited to, people who are not dudes just on the front line. So I think that is the contrast between what we see with the Cuban Revolution and even with the Eritrean Revolution, like women were there on the front lines fighting. And we have folks like Velma Espin, and just the acknowledgement that people who are not dudes can participate in the revolution. Like you're saying, the aunties are there making sure that the communities are okay, and some of them are armed, either through having an M16 or with a book. That's still, all of them are still weapons. But I think when, looking under capitalism, when people are talking about organizing, it tends to be a particular person, a particular body, a particular sensibility that leads to who can organize, and it leaves a lot of other people out, a lot more vulnerable people in the community, particular ages of people, particular bodies of people. And when we talk about organizing, it is usually from the perspective of men leading that. And so just with your experience, your perspective, I know you sort of went a little bit into it, but in terms of a gender analysis, what did you see in terms of that organizing, and what were your perspectives and what were your perceptions? So yes, before you got to Cuba and after you left Cuba, and just organizing in general and the spaces with the action between folks of various genders.
Yeah. So before I got a chance to go to Cuba, actually my work study circle finished reading Women in Society by Salifu Ture. Yes. And so one of the big things that I took away from reading that text was that it's not simply enough to empower women or people of marginalized genders, right? Like by words to say, oh, like the revolution belongs to you too. What Salifu Ture and his party did was bring the revolution to those women's door. So when you read that text, you're not reading it as him lamenting the women and saying, you're responsible for your own oppression. No. Like he is saying that, but he's saying it because he's like, I need you to come outside. Like society has pushed this message to you that you have a particular role to fill, that you have to be a particular way. But what I'm telling you is that the time is now. It's outside, open the door. Hey, we out. We out here. Y'all have to come out. And because I'm bringing this thing to you, if you don't come out and receive it, you will be complicit in your own oppression, if not, right? So I think about that a little bit like Fidel. One thing that people don't think about in terms of the Cuban Revolution, at least the guerrilla warfare component of it, is that it did start, yes, in the Sierra Maestra Mountains with a bunch of dudes with guns. But at the same time as Fidel was organizing in the mountains and going throughout the countryside and collecting people to join their cause, there was a whole communist party in Havana, right, that was organizing, and it was being led by women and Africans. And by the time Fidel makes it to Havana, there's this perfect storm of the brute force and the guns and these people who already have a plan. Fidel isn't even a communist when he comes to power, right? Like that doesn't happen until much later. This is about Fidel's willingness to be brought to ideology by the people. And a lot of those people that bring Fidel to communism are women. They are Africans, right? They've already been there. They've already studied communism. They were already doing the reading. They already had this vision for what their society could be like. And so Fidel was this like evil, dictator who didn't give a fuck about what women had to say. Cuba may have never become an outwardly socialist project. That was the organization of women and African people and other people of marginalized genders who've been written about, but don't really get discussed a lot when you talk about the Cuban Revolution. So then when you look at the modern day, on every systemic structural level, there's no place that I went, no conversation that I participated in, no group of people that I saw represented that did not include women as a part of the general framework. But then Cuba understands their analysis of patriarchy, and the way that it works is that you have to go further than that. It's not even just about the incorporation of women into the existing structures. You have to empower women to create their own structures that have agendas that influence the state as well. So we met with lots of women's organizations, women entrepreneurs, women. You already know faith-based institutions tend to harbor lots of women as well, who the state is prioritizing these women's products, these women, these things created by women, made by women. Like, you need to buy them to support the women's economy in Cuba. But that is just on the sort of basic day-to-day level, operations of how you make money, how you get paid. In terms of like the work of sustaining the revolution, the women CDRs that I met greatly outnumbered the male CDRs that I met. And the women are having open conversations about patriarchy. I've been thinking about this since I got back, because I've observed the conversations online, which have been really bad on both fronts about like Black men and like patriarchy. And they kind of are very like US centered, but the conversation about patriarchy in Cuba is wide open. Like, it's not like they're having it in a corner over here. Like, it's a conversation that's being had from the ground level of children, right? Like, you're introducing the concept of patriarchy to children, and that is, it emanates up throughout the country. The same thing is at play, I think, when it comes to disability and disability organizing. So I got a chance to go to a talk with disability organizers on the island, people who represent the deaf community, the blind community, and people with other sort of like physical disabilities as well. They talked a lot to us about the challenges that the blockade has been creating for disability organizing in particular, but also the victories that the disabled community has won since the beginning of the revolution. And one of the things from that meeting that really stood out to me is that in Cuba, there's a concerted effort from the moment a person is pregnant. If a doctor determines or detects that the child may have any sort of social disability related to their sight, their hearing, extremities, mobility, the parents are not only given the sort of medical support that they need. And I hate saying medical because they don't separate medicine and psychology in Cuba. They're all the same thing. You're an eye doctor, you're a dentist, you're a psychologist, you're a primary, like it all is a part of the same structure. But the family is also assigned a psychologist who specializes in disability, who begins preparing the family before the child is even born to start thinking about and processing their feelings of raising a disabled child, a deaf child, a blind child. They get support from the state about ways to have difficult conversations. This is before the child is even born, okay? So before the child comes out of the womb, they're already getting into the minds of the general population in terms of how they think about disabled people. That has a huge ripple effect on the country in general, in terms of the way that they think about disabled people. And so the Africans that I spoke to that were deaf, and I signed American Sign Language, I didn't realize we would have so much in common between American Sign Language and Spanish Sign Language, but they were really excited to talk to me, and they were just like, do you work with deaf people in the United States? Do you work with deaf people in the United States? And I was like, no, I'm sorry, like, to tell you, I only did this in college, so I don't have day-to-day experience with this anymore. But they were really excited to sort of share the older Africans that I met. I met a blind African and a deaf African who were both born before the revolution, both women, by the way, who were talking to me about how before the revolution, if you were a disabled person in Cuban society, you were discarded, not just by the state, but by your family, by like the people who are supposed to be closest to you in your life. And it was a very hard existence to live. It created a huge rate of like suicide among disabled people in Cuba. And then to be disabled and African, it was just like a perfect storm of they never thought that they would even be here today. And then to now live in this post-revolutionary society, they all said, we feel like we have taken our place in society. One of the women had just completed a doctoral program. The other woman was a lawyer, had recently become a lawyer, but they were talking about all this assistance that they get from the state to do the things that they do. Whether it's interpreters who go with them to all their classes, specialized schools that are being built and created for deaf and blind communities, they have support from the state infrastructure. But the blockade has done this really fucked up thing. I'm sorry, you asked me a question about women, and now I'm talking about disabled people, but it's just the fact that women are so integrated into all areas of the organizing, whether you're talking about youth organizing, artist organizing, I'll tell one more part of women's organizing while I'm talking about the impacts of the blockade one more time. But they were saying they have all this infrastructure and all this support system that they're ready to give people on the island. The blockade is seriously preventing walkers, canes, the development of prosthetics, all these things that people need on the island is particularly hitting the disabled communities. And when it comes to women's organizing, another thing that women are organizing around related to patriarchy is domestic violence, right? Because the revolution, socialism, they come and they create processes to deal with these things, but they don't eliminate them completely. You still have lots of misogynistic and abusive men that exist in Cuban society. But what socialism says is we have to materially empower women to change their circumstances so that if you find yourself in a domestic violence situation, you need somewhere to go. You can't be stuck in a home with a man who abuses you because you have nowhere else to go. So it's a responsibility of the state to build safe houses. It's the responsibility of the state to continue to build homes so that we can just start moving women around. If you need to leave this province, go to that province, then you are empowered to do that. And there will be a safe place for you to go when you do that. But again, the materials needed to create construction projects are being held back by the blockade. And so the government is having to make difficult decisions about how are we prioritizing construction? Who are we building homes for? And these are the nuanced conversations, obviously, that are happening on the island where they're saying, I don't know, maybe y'all don't need to build no more houses over there. Let's build some more safe houses for women. And then the other organizations are like, but we would like more nursing homes. And these are all healthy conversations to have intra-communally. But at the end of the day, women sit at the table to lead and participate in all those conversations. Whereas in the United States, in capitalist societies, patriarchy is aided and abetted. So all we do is create the illusion of women participating in things, and patriarchy sort of continues to go and flourish.
Yeah, so the difference between sitting at the table in a more humanistic society versus an individualistic and capitalistic one is that there's still a ceiling in that individualist. So people like, oh yeah, seat at the table, but like you still don't have any systemic power you still don't have ownership in the means of production, and you don't participate in the decision making. You're just a face, a representative face. I think that's the primary difference. Yeah.
Right. And not to cut you off, but also another thing that we do is we just like task force everything to hell. So it's like, hey, okay, women, then go over here and work on the women's issues and we'll hear what you're talking about, as opposed to that integration into the systems and structures that already exist. So when we talk about labor organizing in the United States, right, we are talking, like when people say I organize labor or I organize the working class, they're talking about white men that drive trucks. They're never talking about women or Africans when they're talking about labor organizing. But labor organizing in Cuba is Black women who make and sell dresses. That's labor organizing to them, right? So those are people who get to lead conversations about labor organizing. It's not just men who build things or drive trucks, or like people who work on assembly lines. Women work on assembly lines, so they are labor organizers. And that's I don't know, that's like the clear, distinct difference. It's like we compartmentalize everything just to get women out of the way so that we can get back to the big boy business. But that's not how I've seen Cuba approach these things. And again, I'm a man, right? A cisgender man in Cuba observing things for 10 days. You might meet a woman who is a part of Cuban society who might tell you it's a little bit more difficult than that, or complicated than that, or nuanced than that, and we still have lots of things to fight. I don't want to take that agency away or speak over anybody in that way. I just want to point out that there are clear differences in the way that it works there as opposed to the way that they work here.
Oh yeah, this is an amazing episode, man. I don't know, Jamilah, do you have anything else you want to add or say?
Yep.
Okay. All right, cool. All right, we appreciate you, Salifu, man. I don't know if you want to have any last words or anything you want to chime in that you may have going on. I want to bring up before we close.
Last thing I want to say: collect your threads, your infographics, and all the things that you are creating and posting here in the global north, because it's not doing anything. We need to stand. What's the word? Unequivocally, any one of those two, in support of the Cuban people and the Cuban Revolution and the ending of the blockade on Cuba. Consider how inhumane it is that the country you live in for the past 60 years has been prohibiting an island full of people from reaching their fullest potential. People who are being born today, a child was born today that is going to be punished for their grandparents' refusal to be owned and governed by the United States. These are not the kinds of things that you get to vote for politicians passively for, go out in the street and electric slide, and then go make a Twitter thread one day about anti-Blackness in Cuba without taking some personal responsibility to work for. If the Cuban Revolution is lost, which I do believe that every person I met in Cuba will lay down their life before they let the Cuban Revolution be lost. But if the Cuban Revolution is lost, that blood is on our hands. As a new generation of young people who are alive to witness and see what our country is doing to Cuba, if Cuba is lost to neoliberalism and neocolonization and imperialism, it's going to be on us. It's going to be on each and every one of us that never said anything about it. It's going to be on each and every one of y'all threads about how anti-Blackness is global, which is why we don't have to stand in solidarity with nobody who ain't Black. It's going to be because of all that shit. And I hope that you have to live with that, because Cuba being lost is not just a loss for the Cuban people, it's a loss for African people everywhere. They are in such an advanced stage of their struggle that most of us cannot comprehend. Brother Obi Egbuna Jr. says it all the time. We don't know what freedom smells like, tastes like. We never felt it. We never breathed clean and sovereign air. I had a chance to go do that for a little while. I'm coming back to try to tell everybody I've seen it. It's real. It's not an exaggeration, but people are fighting for it, and we have to help them fight for it. Even if you aren't going to do a damn thing for the person next door to you, which you should do something for the person next door to you. You should make it. You should do something.
So I just cut you off. But I do want to challenge you on saying "our" because this is not our country.
That's true. That's true. You're so right. The country that you live in, Yeah, because you're right. This is not my shit. And also leaving the country made me realize for the first time that, like, not for the first time because I've been knew this, but it hit a little different. This is not my mess to clean up. Good luck, Europeans. But yeah, my mind is on Africa. I don't know. But yeah, like this will be a huge loss for African people everywhere because they're leading the way right now. Cuba and the Africans in Cuba are leading the way. We are following their path, not the other way around. And there's so much that we can learn from them, but we have to give them we have to help them create the opportunity to finish realizing the beautiful project that they already started.
Yes, indeed. And not only with the Pantsula Podcast, but we do have other programs which do address the Cuban solidarity movement that exists. And we have everything from the bi-weekly Pan-African News Now with our comrades in the Chihuahua territory / New Mexico chapter. We have our Ancestors' Voices. We have the Revolutionary African Women podcast, and we have the Forward Ever podcast. So those are 4, including Pantsula Podcast. And of course, we have We Charge Colonialism. We Charge Genocide, but there's the We Charge Colonialism. We have BAT, BAR, all kinds of acronyms, but they all understand the importance of Cuban solidarity, the importance of anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, and anti-Zionist movements in order to forge with our liberation. So we want to really, really thank you so much, Comrade Salifu, for being here with us and discussing your experience and the change that has occurred in you with this experience. And I think we should all do this type of work. And if we can't physically do it, like Marcus Garvey couldn't physically go to Africa, but he spent his life making sure that Africa was liberated. And I think we should all do the same. So thank you once again. Thank you, Comrade Sadiq, for being here and doing this next episode here of Pantsula Podcast. And we want to say organize, 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 because organization decides everything, as it says, and forward ever, backwards never.
Whatever.